Hello, folks, and posterity. I will try my best to keep this to around 45-ish minutes, but if there is any point, something like, hey, you said this, but I don't know what that is. Can you please explain this? You glaze right over this. Can we pause and talk for a second? Please interrupt me anytime. I have a lot of stuff here, but I want this to be conversational. I don't want to just talk the entire time. Okay? So if there's anything you want to jump in with, just please do. So let me just say, last week we talked about we called it after the apostles, the generation or so after the first generation after Jesus. So there was John, the disciple, and then he discipled Ignatius and Polycarp, and then Irenaeus was the disciple of Polycarp. And there's just really fascinating writings that come from them and about their lives that are really compelling. We looked at those. We had to skip over a lot of interesting other people as well, we just didn't really have the space or time to do that. And one other figure we'll talk about just very briefly is, before we get to the actual Cappadocians proper, I'll mention just two other figures really quickly that we do not have time for. I ambitiously thought we would, but we don't. It's Athanasius and Augustine. Augustine, let me just say, he comes after this era that we're talking about now. And the reason why I didn't want to try and tackle Augustine is because Augustine is so interesting, so fascinating, and so impactful that I didn't think we could really do him justice in the time that we have. Plus, personally, I've only had so much exposure to Augustine's writings, and the Confessions is a wonderful piece of writing. It's the thing that I first came across in the early church fathers just broadly. It's the very first thing I ever read from front to back, and it's wonderful. The only recommendation I have is just go find a copy that you like and read it. It's really wonderful. I won't say anything more about Augustine before I get myself in hot water, but he is really fascinating, and his influence is really hard to get away from in the West. And then Athanasius we'll get to in just a second. But one of the people who this scholar, Michael Holmes, says about this kind of era of things in the life of the church, he says that it was how does he phrase it? He said the apostles had defined at the center of the faith, but it fell to the later generations to define the edges. And that's the kind of era that we're in with these church fathers and mothers, is that the initial folks were trying to find their way through it, how to follow Jesus faithfully, especially in the midst of a lot of persecution and bloodshed, and they were ready to give their lives. And we saw all three of the folks last week that we talked about were martyrs for the faith. At least we think Irenaeus was as well. And then something drastically shifts in 313. It's the Edict of Milan. It is when Christianity becomes legal within the empire, and it is no longer formally persecuted. And then Constantine comes in. And then the Council of Nicaea happens. We'll talk kind of in between these councils. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time with them, other than the things that are going on around them. We'll talk about them some in those other courses, but like I said, we'll touch on them briefly. But this drastically changes the kind of tone of Christianity within the Roman Empire. It goes from being this persecuted minority to this influential minority to now it is formally endorsed by the empire. It's not, I think, for another generation or so that it becomes legally the religion of the empire, but it's in this kind of in-between era when the Christians are trying to figure out how to speak about these things that once you cross this, figurative line, we're no longer talking about Jesus, you're talking about something else. And it is in the midst of all of these things that some of these Trinitarian controversies occur, and they can get really sticky really quick. And so I personally that is not what fascinates me about this era. I think there are some fascinating things in that, but it gets so technical and whatever so quickly that I just stay on the fringes of that and look at other aspects of this era. So that's what we will do. But in order to get there, like I said, we'll look just for a split second at Athanasius. Oops, let's go back. It went too fast. Athanasius. So he was at Nicaea, which is 325. It's where the Nicene Creed or Creed of Nicaea, but it's not the one that we say on Sunday mornings. We'll come to that in a bit. But it's where the first version of that creed comes from. And there's a single line in there. It goes through who the Father is, who Jesus is, and then it has this one line, and the Holy Spirit. And it keeps going. Doesn't say anything else about the Holy Spirit. And so this is the era when they're trying, some of the people, especially the Cappadocians, are trying to hammer out how do we speak about the Holy Spirit? Is it something lesser? Is he something equal? And that's when this era is when that kind of gets hammered out. There's Athanasius, and he is a really staunch defender of the things that are claimed at Nicaea. This particular word, homoousios, is Jesus is of the same substance as the Father. And this term it becomes controversial. There's homoousios and homoousios or something like that. It's of the same substance or a similar substance. These are really drastic and bitter fights about how do we speak about these things. And I personally, I'm glad that I'm not of this era, because that stuff is said complicated, and it is hard to talk about the Trinity. Have y'all ever gotten into a conversation with someone about the faith, about what we believe, and you're like, well, the Trinity is like this. And you go, oh, no, wait, that's not quite right. Oh, that can be confusing. Oh, well, the Trinity is a little bit like ice, water, and steam. No, that's not quite right. There's these metaphors that we try to grasp for. Then we really quickly go, I should probably just leave it right there. And that's kind of what they're dealing with, and these people who want to assert things. Anyways, so Athanasius comes after, or he's at the Council of Nicaea. He's not really prominent there, but afterwards he becomes a staunch defender to the point where he can't let these conversations go. He wants to consistently call out this heresy called Arianism, and to the point where he gets exiled 5 times because the emperor's like, okay, we've had enough. Just go ahead and let sleeping dogs lie. And he says, no, I need to talk about Arianism. We need to root out this heresy that is still going around. So that's Athanasius, and he speaks a little bit about the Holy Spirit, but it becomes to the Cappadocians to really pick up that mantle and really articulate things further. So that brings us to the Cappadocians. And that first slide, actually, I'll go back for just a second. So this is in Cappadocia. And on your map, they have this region highlighted, this Cappadocia. This place is mentioned, I think it's in 1st or 2nd Peter to the Christians in Cappadocia. But this is the region. And it's this wonderful place. It's really fascinating. This picture I took, there's a couple other videos that I'll show in a second of pictures and videos that I took, me and Leah took when we were there. Living in Turkey, we took a vacation out to this place. And it is magical. It's like Dr. Seuss on Mars or something like that. It's very strange. As you see here, these are these things called fairy chimneys, these weird things that are formed from the earth. I think it was like trillions of years ago or something. Millions of years ago, these volcanoes erupted in the region and covered all this place in this volcanic ash and whatnot. And over time, these places eroded, and then there's these communities that lived in these spaces, and they would carve out these places to live. These little hand-carved caves, and even more than that. But this is the region of Cappadocia. Here's some more. It is so incredible. It is just mind-blowing. So I didn't take either of these pictures, but these are just some homes. That was likely the entrance to a church. But I did take this one. Let's see if it plays. The video is a little janky because I took it on an old iPhone 4 or whatever when we lived there. But this is inside of one of those hand-carved spaces. It's this old, tiny little chapel.
Wow.
And you can see these paintings that were put on the walls by these Christians who used to live there. So this, I actually don't know about the specifics of any one of these places that we visited. They most likely came around the time of the Cappadocians or a few centuries later. They obviously would have been updated and things like this, but this is as it stood. Obviously, you can still see the paint on the walls, but it wouldn't have been as worn down. But later on, we'll kind of hint now at what happens later. This place has become abandoned and people are driven out and new people come in, especially during the Muslim conquest of these regions. Which is why, very quickly, if you'll notice, this and the other painting that you'll see, the faces are scratched out of the icons of the paintings because Muslims don't believe that you're allowed to depict figures in art. So they scratch the faces out. Here's one more. Yeah, let's do this.
Did you take these?
Yeah, these are Cappadocia. It's kind of dark. You can't see it there, but it'll go out. Especially go forward a little bit. This is cross. Again, this is into the ceiling in this rock. This is not something that is made elsewhere and then brought in. There's Leah for scale. These little doors here that they carve in, and kind of stumbling around over here. And then you'll see as I exit, you'll see what is outside. Oh, wow. And notice the entryway is coming up. You have to climb up this hill. Obviously, it may have been a little bit more accessible for folks back then, but this is a consistent feature in this region. These little tucked away little places where that's where they live in big community, that they had these churches, and it's really incredible. So this is a picture of that place that we saw in the video. And then here, not a picture I took. There are a couple of these also in the region, these places that are these underground cities. They're like human anthills. This one in particular was Diyarbakir, or is in Diyarbakir now. And it goes all the way down. We think that these cities were made before Christians were on the scene, but then Christians take them over and keep working on them. So down here, I had pictures, but they were just so dark you couldn't really see. This down here is actually a cross-shaped thing in the ground. It was the lowest layer down, and that was where they held church. It was like the most primitive form of a basilica. They had this cross-shaped church, and off the bottom of the church, they had this little tiny hole that was like yay high. You had to squat to walk through, and that's where they buried the bodies of people that died in their community. Yeah, this is in the same region. Now let's talk a little bit more about Cappadocia and the Cappadocians, these people from this region. I highlighted on here. It's not on your map, but I wanted to put specifically these three names so you know exactly what we're talking about. These three, on yours there it says Cappadocia. These are Nyssa, Caesarea, and then Nazianzus. These three little towns here in Cappadocia. And those pictures and the videos that I showed you are like almost right dead in the center of that little triangle that's there. That's in Cappadocia. That's the specific region that Leah and I stayed in. Here's a few of the things that are filled out on the map for us. This is the kind of new state of the political sphere. The Parthian Empire is now the Sassanid Empire. Here's Irenaeus up here, and then a few other places, Alexandria down here, and Constantinople and Nicaea. Notice how close those two are. All right. That being said, let's talk a little bit about the Cappadocians. Well, the Cappadocians are this family, this almost dynasty of the Christians, and they're really quite amazing. The names get confusing really quickly. I'm so sorry. There's the grandmother, who's Macrina the elder, and then there is her children. Her son is Basil the elder, and then his wife Elaminus, I think her name is. Yeah. Emilia, something like that. And she's the daughter of a Christian, a martyred Christian. And so already there's this model of faithfulness in their home. And then they have 10 children. And I think it's 3 or 4 sisters, and the rest are brothers. And Macrina the younger is the oldest of them. And it's really fascinating. It's really wonderful that this family, this dynasty of these Christians, it is the grandmother, the 2 parents, and 5 of the brothers and sisters that are sainted in this family that later on become sainted. And so this family really is great. Okay, so then let's talk about the actual life of these folks, Macrina and her brothers, and then their friend Gregory as well. Again, sorry about the names. There is Macrina, the sister, Basil of Caesarea, who also is called Basil the Great. And then there's one of the younger brothers, Gregory of Nyssa. And then there's Gregory of Nazianzus, who is their friend, the 2 brothers, like a really close friend, Gregory of Nazianzus. Again, sorry, I will inevitably trip over and call the Gregory the wrong one at some point, but we'll see what happens. This family, it is also worth noting that, like we said, this is the turn from the era of the martyrs to the monastic movements, the early monastic movements. And we see that kind of turn even within the life of Athanasius. He's looking back toward St. Anthony, who is one of the kind of early monastics who goes out to the desert to live by himself, live this really dramatic life. And then you come to the Cappadocians, and they start modeling this new way of doing monasticism called Cenobitic, or this kind of like more communal thing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But before that, they are born into this world, and because Christians are becoming a little bit more tolerated, they are a well-to-do family. They're very well privileged and very well off. They have a lot of land that they have access to. And they're able to even send off Basil to go get like properly educated. He goes off whenever they are in their younger years. He goes off to Caesarea. Yeah, first Caesarea, and then Antioch, and then Athens to get formally educated. And he goes there. He goes to Athens, gets the Greek proper education, philosophy, theology, and all these kind of things. And all the while, Macrina and the rest of the siblings are back at home. And Macrina, when she turns 12, she's betrothed to marry someone in the future. And then something happens tragically, and her fiancé passes away. And it's at that time that Macrina says, actually, I'm going to take this time to dedicate my life to God. I will metaphorically, symbolically say, I'm still betrothed to be married to this man who's died. So therefore, I will remain celibate and single and live a life of chastity and devotion and piety and asceticism for God. And that's what she does. And then there's Gregory of Nyssa, the younger brother. He also sticks around. He doesn't, to our knowledge, go and get a formal education. Later on, he'll write about being taught by Macrina and then by Basil when Basil comes back around. So let me see real quick, make sure we've got timeline, everything right. There's a lot of stuff here, and I don't want to skip over all the good beats to the stories. So let's say, So then Basil has gone off to school in Athens, and at the same time, Gregory of Nazianzus, he is also of a pretty well-to-do family. His father is the bishop of Nazianzus just before he is born. And guess what his name is? Also Gregory. And so he sends his son off to go to school. He does Caesarea, Palestine, Alexandria, and then where does he go to next? He goes up to Athens. And that is where he meets Basil, who's already in school. And they're in school for many years there together. They're learning, they're getting their good Greek education. And then at some point, Basil becomes kind of disillusioned with the rhetoric and the heat and some of the immaturity of these kind of conversations. And then he leaves. He comes back to the area where they are. It's around Caesarea. And then eventually, Gregory comes back as well to that area. But whenever Basil comes back, Macrina steps up and she confronts him because he's gone away and got this proper education and has come back quite arrogant, quite full of himself. He's been given the position of a teacher of rhetoric and even takes younger brother Gregory under his wing. And she confronts him and says, "You become very arrogant. Your life isn't devoted to God." And it's not really clear if he just dismisses her totally, but it's not until the tragic death of one of their other brothers that something really clicks in Basil. And then right after that, their father dies as well. And it's at this time that Gregory finally turns and says, "I'm going to be baptized. I'm going to devote my life to God." And it's in a reading of it's one of the gospel narratives where Jesus tells the rich young man to sell everything he owns and to give to the poor. And Basil takes this. He really takes it seriously. He says, "That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give my things away to the poor. I'm going to sell most of our family's land." And he does that. And he really turns something in his life over to this new form of who Basil will be for the future. And he also submits himself to Macrina. He said, "I want you to be my teacher, my spiritual kind of director." And this is the role that Macrina takes on for the family after the death of their father. She becomes their teacher. And she and the mother start this little monastic community of women. And then Basil, at her leading, also starts one of men as well, kind of off to the side. And then at some point, around 350-ish, she sends him to go investigate monastic communities other places. So she sends him to go down, and he goes down and visits some monastic communities in Syria and in Palestine, and then all the way down into Alexandria. And again, if you trace the history of monasticism, that's the region where things are happening in this area. You have the Syrians. We'll talk about them next week. And then Athanasius was, I think, in Egypt, in that area. But yeah, so he comes back then, and back to their community that Macrina and the mother have started. And then he starts and develops their own community and becomes these kind of separate but really closely knit communities of these men and these women. And this is a difference in between the styles of Antony going out into the desert to just be by himself. I'm going to get all material goods and wealth and whatever. Stay away from that because it's bad for my own soul. For Basil and the communities that they start, these synobitic, these communal type things, they're more about the community, the life and health of the community, people that they could reach. It's not to say that Anthony's disposition was a selfish one, but he viewed his getting rid of his material goods as the poor are these things that I can foist these things onto. I want to get rid of the things that trouble me, so I would give them to the poor. And it just so happens it comports with the teaching of Jesus. But for Basil and their community, it's very different. It's community focused, and therefore the way that he talks about the poor is very different. They're not something to foist these distractions onto. They are someone that we have a ethical obligation to look after, to look for, and to bring them into the community, and that our surplus is their good. That's how he looks at this. And this is when this thing that becomes called the Basiliad, I'm guessing that's how you pronounce it, Basil-iad, is what Gregory of Nazianzus will call this new little city that they start building. And it is quite fantastic and inspiring. But before we get to the inspiring part of that, I want us to read just a snippet of what Basil says about this ethical pull and draw toward the love of the poor and our obligation. And I will warn you, this is like gut-punching stuff. And there's a small collection, I didn't bring with me, of these popular patristic series called On Social Justice. I think it's in the recommended list. And it's a collection that he starts preaching around this time. And they are very forceful, and it's hard to squirm from underneath the weight of the things that he's claiming. But the setting, I forgot to mention that the setting for this, the impetus for this, is not just his own personal conviction. There's also a drought that begins in 369, and thus there's a large famine, and people are going hungry, there's not a lot of work, and people are not doing well. And so in the midst of this, Basil starts preaching, and he says this in one of his sermons. He preaches on the parable where Jesus says there's a rich man who had a surplus of grain. He says, "I would tear down my barns in order to build bigger ones in order to store the surplus." That's the sermon, or that's the passage that he's preaching on. When he says, "I will pull down my barns and build larger ones," he's quoting there. "Well done, I would say for my part. The treasuries of injustice well deserve to be torn down. With your own hands, raise these misbegotten structures. Destroy the granaries from which no one has ever gone away satisfied. Demolish every storehouse of greed. Pull down the roofs, tear away the walls. Expose the moldering grain to the sunlight. Lead forth from prison the fettered wealth. Vanquish the gloomy vaults of mammon. And in this last line, that is amazing. If you want storehouses, you have them in the stomachs of the poor. There's so many good things that he says in this collection of sermons, but this really captures the heart of it. Both the gut punch, the thrust of what he's trying to claim, tying it to the commands of the gospel. But then also this line here, with your own hands raise these misbegotten structures. It's also, we notice, if we can credit him with this, he's also being attentive not just to our obligation to an individual poor person. He's also attentive to these structures, what we now talk about as systemic problems. It's not merely your duties to help someone that you come across. It's our duty, our ethical duty as Christians to pay attention to these problems that plague us all, plague the community, that are hard to put our finger on sometimes. He talks elsewhere about this tendency for us to justify our lifestyles, and as our finances raise, our needs raise proportionally as well. But as we get richer, what we thought we would have been more comfortable at 30, this amount of money per year, and then this amount of money per year, but somehow that need just raises right with it. He's really suspicious of this, and he talks about this as well. He also, in another sermon just called on lending, I think it's called on lending, he also talks about the insidious nature of lending practices, how they can be very predatory. He talks about this as well. So he, unlike some of the other folks, he is really attentive to these kind of structural aspects of poverty and wealth redistribution. And that's what this community becomes, is the Basiliad becomes this distribution center. Initially, it's just because of the famine, and then becomes much more than that. Lepers start to come in, and they start taking care of the sick people, and people find homes there, and they have this little community. And then in, I think it's 370, he's elected bishop, not just priest, but he becomes bishop of the area of Caesarea, and that's where Caesarea comes from. And then more money he's able to allocate to that area, and they even build out the facilities there, and becomes, I think some folks would call this the first hospital, because people are coming in, they have specialized people who come in and treat them with medical knowledge according to their day and understanding. And they have lepers come in, and even Basil himself is known to handle and take care of lepers. And it's this wonderful community that, it's really quite inspiring. So let's see.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Okay. This is going to help me just to recap so that I see what's happening here. Macrina the Elder is the grandmother.
Grandmother, yep.
So she has Basil the Elder and me, and then they have the 10 kids.
Yeah.
These are the 10 kids you got.
Yeah, three of these are some of his kids. Yep.
And so Basil, who's doing this, has submitted himself to his sister-in-law, Macrina the Younger and Amelia. Right?
Yes.
So they're
right.
the ones who started this trained him, sent him off to do a thing he learned.
And then he's come back into the community.
Back.
Yeah.
And so his is different than other Antonines and look at other monks and desert fathers who went out individually to sort of purge themselves and find God and interact in this way. Communities developed around them because they are wise and had these teachings, but they didn't go that intention. But this group has this intention of a different understanding of how we interact with the poor and the world at large. Yeah,
that is my understanding as well. Yeah.
Okay. So just to say all that kind of outline in my head, like maybe Trinity is Macrina the Elder, and we are birthing something that I take the two generations to come with some level of fruition. Yeah. And seeing ourselves in that light maybe takes in some ways takes a little pressure off. Like we don't have to see, we don't know. And we may not see the culmination or fruit of what this could be. Yeah. But to see that in that line and to see ourselves like, wow, we're training and giving birth to next generation who's going to then train this next generation. If we find ourselves in a similar sort of like transition from, I think we're in a reverse transition, right? Because we're not going from being martyred to being a minority and influential minority. We're reversing. Yeah. Right? So we've gone from like, we're the state-sponsored religion or experience of Christianity and then reversing that. So I don't know, it's just a way to ponder how we find ourselves in this moment. Yeah. And that like I mentioned it up front, I'm less interested in all the inter-Trinitarian debates. I'm more interested in that aspect of how
can we look at these folks in their different areas of how they relate to the broader culture, the state, the people that they feel compelled to take care of, and how do we look to them and see different models of how they approach those things? Yeah, I likewise, that's what I really,
I think my brain is where you're going.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else, real quick?
I know several generations later, there's a really interesting thing that happens with Maximus.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been arguing about Jesus' two natures, then they argue about two wills, then they argue about two energies.
Yeah.
And Maximus is the one who says it has to be two natures, two wills, then two energies. And I'm with you. Like, when you see, especially Greek philosophical thinkers, right? They're like such nitpickers, right? You're like, I'm dying in the distinctions here. But with Maximus, there's this sense that he holds on to all the distinctions because of how much he understands that Jesus has to be all that to have the effect.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Is that true for them, you think?
I think so. I mean, the way I've said up front before you came in was I tend to look at this and talk about these folks around the Trinitarian things, but it's not as if they weren't concerned. They're very concerned about that. And I even heard one person recently say, do the church fathers talk about anything but the Trinity? And I think they do. And what I'm trying to pull out is some of the stuff that they are talking around that. But I think they are equally as concerned about all that and debating.
No, I get it. I'm sorry. I know you were sorry for you here. And I'm with you. I'm totally glad. That all makes sense. It's just with Maximus, the light bulb went off for me that, in a very simple way to put it, is big Jesus equals big consequence.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Yeah.
And I think that's true with them too, right? Like, they're going to dig in on who he is. Because in Maximus's case, he ends up getting martyred, as you know, because the emperor wants them to compromise.
Yeah.
Because it'll make life easier for the emperor.
Yeah.
And he refuses.
Yeah.
And so he sees the connection. And I wonder if it's the same that, like, they have such an incredible sense of who Jesus is that it leads them to have the confidence to do these sort of things they do.
I mean, we'll get to this. We won't talk, like I said, much about some of that aspect of these things. But it's Gregory of Nazianzus who says the line, "The unassumed is the unhealed." He's saying, like, if Jesus isn't the full expression of God and man, then we're up to creep without power. I think that's part of that as well.
Yeah.
That big vision of genius.
Yeah.
That was what you just said.
If the unassumed is the unhealed, is how sometimes you can summarize. Meaning,
The unassumed is the
unhealed. So, he's saying he's in his day, and we'll get to this in the Council of Constantinople very briefly. What he's going up against is this view called Apollinarism, which has this slightly, as we said last week, sub-biblical view of Jesus' humanity. And Gregory is very forcefully wanting to say, if Jesus wasn't fully human, if he didn't assume every aspect of what it means to be human besides sin, then how we participate in him is there's still a gap left. So it gets summed up in that phrase, the unassumed is the unhealed. So if Jesus doesn't pull in every aspect of our humanity, then those parts that he doesn't are the parts that are the unhealed parts.
Which is sort of just wonderfully organic, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if it doesn't come into Jesus, how could it be healed?
Yeah.
Right? It's profound, but it's really simple to me.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah. Speaking of the compromising aspect, is again these ongoing debates. At one point, the emperor, I can't remember who it is. I don't know if I wrote it down, but the emperor's coming to town. He's going through Caesarea, where Basil is still bishop there. And he sends ahead of him this Praetorian prefect. And the Praetorian prefect is told, like, hey, Basil is a bit strong-headed. You need to go and subdue him and make sure he stops stirring up trouble, calling out these Arian controversies. During this time, Basil is writing against Eunomius, these ongoing back and forth treatises with this known Arian person whose name is Eunomius. And so here's this prefect coming into town and telling him, like, hey, we need to keep it down, be quiet, especially while the emperor's here. And he even threatens him with a confiscation of his property and exile, torture, maybe even death. To which Basil responds, all that I have that you can confiscate are these rags and a few books, nor can you exile me, for wherever you send me, I shall be God's guest. And death would be a great boon to me, leading me closer to God. And the prefect is put back on his heels and he says, excuse me, a bishop has never spoken to me like this. And Basil retorts, perhaps that is because you have never met a true bishop. This wonderful moment where he steps forward and he's unwilling to compromise pressure of the people and the powers that be. And Lord bless us with the spiritual leaders and folks who will do the same in our age. Let's see. So then, let's see what we have next. I think it's Macrina. Okay. So then around this time in 379, I forgot to mention that at some point, Gregory of Nazianzus, the friend, he comes to join them as a part of their community. And then he goes out and he is against his will because of Basil and Gregory's father. They appoint him bishop of this place called Caesarea, of another little kind of town in the region. And they drive him out. They throw stones at him and he leaves. He doesn't want to be there. And this is a constant thing with Gregory Nazianzus. He doesn't really want to be in leadership roles in that capacity. I think it's something with his disposition. We'll come back to it when we look at his poetry, that it doesn't fit quite right with how he wants to be in the life of the church. And so this puts a little bit of bitterness between him and Basil, and they're never really fully resolved it. And so he then, at the same time, he goes over as well and is then, instead of Caesarea, he is made bishop of Nazianzus. And Gregory of Nyssa is made bishop of Nyssa. So it's during this time that those two folks have come onto the scene as these bishops as well. So then in 379, January 1st of 379, Basil dies. And then both Gregories come forth and they get these eulogies over their friend and brother. And in that moment, Gregory of Nyssa highlights this wonderful new community that Basil has started. And he has also been taking up the cause of the poor in his preaching as well. So then we think it's like almost right after Basil dies that Macrina also turns around, and Gregory of Nyssa writes this book called On the Soul and the Resurrection. On the Soul and the Resurrection. And it is this form of this dialogue where Macrina is on her deathbed and Gregory of Nyssa is just unconsolable. His older sister, the teacher is what he calls her. The teacher, my teacher, is dying and he feels hopeless. And so then she turns and she's the one to console him as she's the one dying. And it becomes this extended conversation on the soul, on the role of the passions and emotions in the life of the Christian and the hope of the resurrection. And there's two little things that's worth noting here, that this is very much in the style of the Socratic dialogue. Plato has this work called the Phaedo, that is the deathbed conversation of Socrates and Plato. And likewise, Plato is distraught at the coming death of his leader, his teacher, Socrates. And they talk about all these things. And the upshot is that, don't worry, to die is good. I'm a disembodied soul. We're all good to go, right? And part of that is also that we don't actually know how much is Socrates, how much is Plato there. So likewise, we're not exactly sure how much is Macrina. We're pretty positive that this being her pupil and then the community, these are the things that she taught. Whether they're the actual specific words, we don't know. But we don't have any other better testament to her life and teachings than what we get from these folks. But it is still very inspiring to see how she counsels him. And one of the things that she says, all the while they're talking about these things, she also countenances a reluctance to get too speculative about the nature of the afterlife and the resurrection. Because like I said, this dialogue is about how exactly do we come back in bodies? What part of our body is in contact with our soul? Where's that? All these really interesting conversations. But she counsels against getting too speculative. She says this. She says, if at night wakeful people discuss at length what light of the sun is like, the grace of its rays by mere appearance makes vain their verbal description. In the same way, every reasoning which conjectures about future restoration will be proved worthless when what we expect comes to us in experience. So there's this whole dialogue about the nature of the resurrection, saying, but let's be careful. Our words can only get us so far.
And what's the title of that book? On the resurrection.
On the soul and the resurrection. Oh. I think that one is on there, the Bible. No, I've heard. Yeah, it's there. But at the same time, she's not unwilling to affirm the things that we hold true. And so she also says this, summarizing their teaching. This is toward the end of that dialogue. She says, incorruptibility, glory, honor, and power, which are agreed to be characteristic of the divine nature, formerly belong to the one made in God's image, and are expected to be ours once again, because the resurrection is nothing other than the restoration of our nature to its original state. Just going back to the scene that we talked about last week, there's this vision of the image of God in the beginning and how something has gone wrong with that, and that the vision of the restored, resurrected life is this going back to what that original intention of God was for human beings. So then she dies, And Gregory of Nyssa is there. He closes her eyes, grieves, and then he leads the funeral procession. And then he and Gregory of Nazianzus take up the mantle that Macrina and Basil. That brings us then to right up to the edge of the Council of Constantinople, which is 381. And this is the Hagia Sophia. The minarets weren't there back then, but this is it. This is where we are in the world. Again, if you have on your map, I think Constantinople is right there. And Constantinople, Istanbul, don't know when the name changed, but it did. But this is the main church that is there. And at some point, Gregory of Nazianzus is called to go into Constantinople because some of these ongoing theological controversy Arians. And then the new emperor calls this council to, once again, they're trying to settle these ongoing debates. And Gregory Nazianzen and Gregory of Nyssa become very influential in that aspect. Gregory of Nazianzen is the bishop of Constantinople at this time, while this is going on. But at a certain point, someone who disagrees with him and wants him out, its voice out of the room, so to speak, points out, says, hey, aren't you already bishop of Sassima and Nazianzus? You can't also be the bishop of Constantinople. And he's like, well, technically you're right. I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to fight. But he just backs out. He just leaves and it goes on without him. And he retires and goes home to this little village that's near where he's from, near Nazianzus. But it's worth just saying really quickly that even though Basil has died, it is his pneumatology, his idea of what the spirit is that really dominates these conversations. So that's one of the few interesting and important aspects of this council, the Council of Constantinople, is that his theology of the spirit really becomes very clear. And we said the Creed of Nicaea from 325 only has the one little line in the spirit. And then this one, it gets expanded into what we have now. And that is the theology of these Cappadocians at work and the influence of making sure we understand that the Spirit is also God and is to be worshipped as such. The other thing that is done at this council is that Jesus is, again, they're making sure it is known that Jesus is also man. He's not just God, he's also man. And then lastly, at this council, Constantinople becomes like formally becomes a patriarchal see on the level of the other few, second only to Rome. This is when this formally happens. Let's not stay on that too much, but say that after this, like we said, Gregory of Nazianzen goes home. He retires back, and he goes back to there, and he comes in and out of retirement to take up something and leave some situations. But at a certain point, at 384, he just goes off into this muddy old little village to retire and be away from all these conversations, and he writes poetry. And this is where we get what we think is the bulk of what his theological poetry. Now, Gregory, that's not all he wrote. He wrote a lot of discourses and a lot of letters, but he also wrote these theological poems. And they're most likely just teaching poems, ways to reword for an accessible audience, some of these complicated things. But some of them are quite personal and quite really fascinating to look into his life. And some of them even feel quite modern. But we'll look at two of these real quick. So he's speaking about, again, like Macrina suggests, let's be careful about the limits of our language and how much we can really say. He says, truly he is the fountain of lights, the light which cannot be named, neither grasped, who flees from an intellect swiftly drawing near, forever outpacing the wits of all, so that yearning, we might struggle anew for what is higher. And then he goes on to talk about the nature of angelic beings and spiritual beings, and then he catches himself and he says, soul of mine, what are you doing? Reason trembles, entering upon heavenly beauties. And then he goes on to describe, he says, it's like when someone comes to a violent stream and they really need to cross, but they pause for a second because they realize what they're about to get into. And he puts his foot out over the water just to check it. And then he concludes saying, he shrinks back till in their struggle, necessity triumphs over fear. So likewise, when I draw close to the unseen deity. Again, we see here in the midst of all these very precise discussions about the nature of the Trinity and the substance of God and so on, he's saying, we also need to be very careful that we don't overstep the limits of what we can actually say about God. So then, like I said, some of his poems are also very personal. Some people even think retrospectively that he may even been clinically depressed. We've seen that he shies away from being too involved and he doesn't really like to be in the center of attention in that way. And some of his other letters suggest he's a bit ornery. But here, this feels modern. You see something he's wrestling through. He says, who was I? Who am I? What shall I be? I do not know clearly, nor can I find one better stocked with wisdom. But as through thick fog I wander, every which way with nothing, not a dream of the things I long for. I am. Think, what does this mean? Something of me's gone by, something I'm now completing, another thing I will be, or I'll be if I will be. Nothing's for sure. I am indeed a troubled river's current, always in transit, having nothing fixed. And he concludes saying, this is the end of the poem. It says, now when the beloved mind had sung for me these things, it digested its pain. And late from the shady grove I headed home, now laughing at this self-estrangement, then once again heart in anguish, smoldering from a mind at war. This line, this self-estrangement, feels very existentialist, very modern in the way of talking about this separation from who I am, who I think I am in the world. So his poems are really quite fascinating. And then lastly, we come down to Basil. And like I said, Gregory's writing until his death. I think it's early 390s, I think it said. And then Basil lives a few years, sorry, not Basil, Gregory of Nyssa lives a few years on as well. And during this time, around this time, he writes this thing called the Catechetical Discourse. It's one of the things I suggest. And it's what it sounds like. It's this book and this treatise that he writes for new believers to talk about the essentials of the faith, baptism, the life of the Trinity, who Jesus is, and so on. And there's some really fascinating things in there. I had an excerpt pulled out from us, but I won't read it. It's a bit longer. But it's this really famous picture he's getting at where he talks about how the hook of Jesus' divinity was hidden by his flesh, his participation in us as humans, in order to get at the enemy. And that the enemy goes in to swallow up the fish of the human and finds that the divinity is there and that he can't be conquered. It's this wonderful, really interesting way of talking about the atonement in this really fascinating way. But he does say, and there's this little bit in here that kind of ties all the way back to what we had on the screen about Athanasius, and again, the themes we talked about last week, but we now look back and call this theme of theosis. He says this as well. Gregory says, the God who was made manifest mingled himself with perishable nature for this, in order that humanity might be deified by communion with the divinity. So so he retreats back to monastic life and dies, but it's not exactly clear when or what the cause of it is. So this is the end of their lives, but let me say a couple more things about them just in way summary. So it's really fascinating, again, that we looked at last week. It's something that I heard from someone else. I think is a really wonderful way to say it, is that they are really concerned with both sides of the orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And what you will hear a lot about these folks is that they're really, really concerned about the language of the Trinity, and that's true. I hope that we have highlighted some of the other things that they're concerned about as well. The life of what it means to follow Jesus, to look after the poor, and what that requires from them and hopefully from us as well. And we see that in them, and that we see some of this legacy even in the work of Gregory, the younger brother. We think that it is in his commentary on Ecclesiastes that we have for the very first time slavery as a category totally condemned for the very first time from an ethical standpoint. It's not, hey, maybe we should change something, but he totally condemns it. It's just this one passing thing that happens, but we go, something has really changed in the way they're viewing the life of the world and the community and their commitment to it. And then we also have Gregory of Nazianzus. This is where this phrase, the Trinity as three hypostasis in one ousia, comes from. There's a really condensed summary of Trinitarian orthodoxy. This comes from him, this way of summarizing these things. So that's really interesting and fascinating and really good to hold on to. But, it's also in the midst of all these technical discussions that, going back again to Basil, he also talks about the limitations of language and how we can't quite put our finger on the nature of the Spirit. He says, the very substance of God is beyond all intelligence and beyond all human knowledge. I think that comprehension of God's substance transcends not only human beings, but also every rational creature. And then he concludes by saying, for it is a mark of a pious mind to be aware of attributing to the Holy Spirit those things that the Holy Scriptures omit in silence, and to be convinced that experience and exact comprehension of him is reserved for us in the subsequent age, when, passing beyond the vision of the truth that comes dimly in a mirror, we will be deemed worthy of contemplating face to face. So I think that is worth holding on to. Yeah. This tension between trying to fight for orthodoxy, but being very attentive to the fact that our language is quite limited in the way we speak about these things. And then these things are balanced by an ethical kind of pull into the life of the community and the responsibility towards others. Yeah, and I think these folks really catch this balance really well. So That's all I have. What other questions or thoughts or things do you think of? Or are you surprised by any of this? Have you all ever heard of the movement, the Basil kind of Basiliad thing? You have, Eric? Really? What have you heard before about it?
Well, I guess I've seen in various places some of just a lot of their quotes, and I have a very vague understanding of the family tree.
Yeah.
There was a lot of them. That's all I remember. There was a lot of really smart people in the family.
Good. Yeah.
That's probably about as far as I could take it.
Yeah. When I went my first semester, I took a church survey course and I had to read this book that goes through everything. And I remember on one little page, I was going back through to remind myself of some of this. I had written off in the margins a family tree because I was like, who is Macrina? Who is Gregory? Wait, which Gregory? I found that this week when I went back through some of this. That old family tree off to the side of the margins.
I'm fascinated by the change in monastic practice. I've never heard that. And that's something that was really interesting. How what you talked about with that. So this, I don't know. You see something change like that, and you just really want to ask why.
Yeah.
What did they say amongst each other? We have to do this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really fascinating.
This is a little bit of a teaser, and something I'm curious about is the fact that Basil goes down through Syria and Palestine. I know that in early Syria stuff, and we'll get to some of this in the last week, that their model of what we call like a proto-monastic movement, they didn't really talk in the same way at first. They had these communities, this designated category called the B'nai Kayama, which was the sons and daughters of the covenant. And there were these people who were, even if they were married, they would together take a vow of celibacy and live as these people of the covenant within that community. They wouldn't retreat out to go elsewhere, they would stay in the community. And I'm suspicious and curious if Basil came in contact with some of that stuff, and that was part of that inspiration that he brought back as well. Is that more communal life version of that?
Because that also seems like it might possibly relate into some of their what we would call social justice concerns.
Yeah.
Because they didn't remove themselves so much,
Right.
but they had communities that were different.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it could be connected somehow.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting questions.
Yeah. Anything else?
How do these intersect into our current Anglican orientation? Are they still, where are they in?
Yeah, these latter three folks, I think it's these three, Basil, Gregory, and Gregory, are called the three holy hierarchs. And Gregory of Nazianzus, he sometimes for shorthand is called Gregory the theologian by the church. And he's only one of three people that the Eastern Orthodox folk call the theologian. And in the Roman Catholic tradition, they are part of, I think it's the 37 doctors of the church. So they are part of a long tradition of people that then the church before it really starts to split. And it's around this time, the councils, the coming two councils, the stuff starts to get hairy and split. Not until fully divided at the 1054. But it's in this common life of the church before the Eastern and Western splits that they're in this era, and the churches, both of these grand traditions, the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholics, and the Anglicans in the line of the Protestants coming out of Roman Catholics, all look back at these folks and say, these folks are trustworthy and the venerable. That's how my understanding is, that their legacy and understanding has not really been changed as it comes to the Protestant tradition. Would you say different?
So the kind of beginning of the Anglican movement, there's Luther and Calvin and Zwingli on the continent. And then what happens in England is kind of keep the forms of worship and stuff that the Catholic Church had, but bring in the Reformation emphasis on Scripture. And that uniqueness, that what also begins to happen is, if you read John Donne, for instance, Donne quotes Basil all the time in his sermons. Donne reads Basil, and Lancelot Andrews, who's part of the forming of the King James Bible. All these people start reading these guys. I mean, not that Calvin and the others didn't, but there's more of it. It's somehow, because they kept the Catholic form, they also stayed closer to this. I think that last bit, I think it was the Gregory of Nazianzus quote about, we don't want to say things that aren't in Scripture. There's this sense the Anglican way appreciates their sense of mystery and their sense of we're going to be committed to as much as we're given, but we also recognize that we're not given everything. So what we don't say is, in that sense, is as important as what we do say. And that's very similar today to, say, Orthodoxy, the Eastern Orthodox churches, who probably are the ones most committed to these folks of anybody in the world today. Although the Catholic Church certainly is. And I think everybody's committed to the Cappadocians, I think. But yeah, so it doesn't, I don't know that it plays super explicitly, but there is the kind of a renewal of people of your generation who had a new interest in these folks and others that you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's a sense, I think, an appreciation of, for lack of a better way, just the way that they felt. And they had this sense of Jesus person and his energy, his charisma, whatever the right word is. They really lived in that. They didn't want to lose it.
Yeah.
I think that's attractive. I don't know if that gets at what you're thinking about, but
What? I meant for in court.
I mean, like a lot of things in humanism, it's not super defined, but there is an appreciation, at least, of the way they saw things as giving them the ability to untie the knot at Nicaea. In other words, that it wasn't, it was how smart they were, but it was also something about the way that they only committed to that which was given, but that which was given had to be enough. And you put those two together, and then you have to work off what we do know. And that's sort of what gives them a oomph to break through, maybe. That's my best thought. And that's very Anglican, or rather we appreciate it that way and try to bring that into our life.
Getting to be all that I've seen, to believe that all that I haven't seen.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the whole thing, Macrina's a bit about, think about C.S. Lewis that he wrote, I forget, where he's sitting in the garden, he's sitting in his shed in the back garden. And he sees the sunlight coming in, and he says, I can't describe the light, but it's the way I see everything else. Well, I mean, he knows these people like the back of his hand. He's just, or whether he's not doing it consciously, he's incorporating all that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's who he is.
He wrote the introduction to Athanasius's On the Incarnation, one of the more modern translations. Yeah. There's one of the authors that I read as I was looking at Gregory and Nazianzus, and he even used the word via media. I was like, that kind of trickled in. That was interesting. He said that about his way of navigating those discussions as well. He used that same phrase. I was like, that works well with that.
Well, Toby, it's really fun to see how passionate you are about this.
Yeah. Thanks.
You're off next week, right?
Correct. Yeah, Rainy and
back
I.
in 2 weeks.
Yeah, going down. Yeah. And last week we'll do. Yeah, Lord willing, we'll try and do Ephraim and Isaac and Nineveh. Maybe little John of Damascus, but at least those two folks. So.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for coming. You're so welcome.